think that's why, that the kind of circles back to being mindful of the direction that the goods are flowing in, right? The equivalent direction for the U.S., like Mexico border example, is not, people from Central America or Latin America coming into the U.S. via Mexico. The analogous setup is individuals leaving the U.S. with some resource, smuggling it into Mexico, where it's then dismantled and sold on like a gray market down there, right? And so that's one thing we have to be mindful of. The other is, I think, it's an excellent point. Could it be the case that something about the nature of the flow of individuals, their characteristics, their aspirations, right? Those are all different, maybe. But no, actually, I don't think that they're terribly far off. A lot of the sort of economic opportunities on a daily basis. So if we think about the inflows and outflows at major border crossings in the U.S., most of the daily back and forth are individuals who are very frequently moving back and forth across the border for economic reasons. Same thing in Israel.
You mentioned that even if, as per preliminary conclusions that you've drawn, even if a end-to-end border wall were to be built, it would not have a significant impact on most of the variables that you study. But if you look at the Israeli border wall in Sinai, if I'm right, its purpose was to reduce illegal immigration coming in from Africa. And there are certain statistics on this. Between 2005 and 2012, there were about 60,000 illegal immigrants who are reported to have crossed into Israel. And after the construction of the wall, as per the latest statistics available for 2016, it came down to just 11. That's a reduction from 8,000 per year to just 11 after the construction of the wall. I'm curious to know why there is such a drastic drop that has happened.
Yeah, no, it's not. So that is not something that we looked at in this particular study. The nature of our study is focused effectively purely on a certain kind of criminal activity so that we can draw inferences. But one could think that you could imagine conducting a similar study of construction along that barrier. Now, one always has to be careful when you hear a statistic like that, where you're dropping from maybe even tens of thousands a year to dozens. It makes me wonder, I'm a little suspicious whether or not the nature of data collection has changed.
Yeah, that's what I thought too.
Yeah, and so, I think one always has to be mindful of the politics of data collection, right? And in our particular case, we get to take advantage of the fact that the government had no idea that the policy might have consequences for car theft. And so there were no political reasons to conceal or misrepresent the data. And so whenever I hear a statistic like that, where a single intervention has the possibility of reducing something by some incredible margin, I'm naturally a little skeptical.
Yeah, sounds suspicious to me.
Yeah, but definitely worth turning over some stones and seeing if there's anything there, in part because this gets back to this question you asked earlier about external validity. There are dozens of border walls around the world under construction. And many of these segments are being justified in part because of the humanitarian crisis that we are seeing, or that at least we saw unfold over the last decade, where individuals coming from South and North Africa, the Middle East, making really difficult decisions, putting their lives on the line in the hope of finding economic opportunities, political freedom, the ability to raise a family without constantly worrying about them being targeted by a repressive regime. All of those things drove a massive wave of people north into Europe and has justified, at least in principle, the politics of extremism in some contexts, which inevitably turned to border fortification.
As China's role grows greater on the global stage, you want to stay up to date on the issues most pressing to China both domestically and internationally. Check out the Just China podcast for in-depth analysis on recent headlines and investigative reports on Chinese matters that affect our globalized world. We are Just China. Find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your podcast listening.
Talking specifically of the US-Mexico border wall, whenever people talk of the intensity of illegal immigration, there are two comparative statistics that are talked of. One is that the number of illegal immigrants were 1.6 million in 2000, And that has reduced to about 500,000 last year. But if you look at this more carefully, it's actually the number of people apprehended while trying to cross the border and not the total number of people who actually managed to cross the border. And we don't have hard statistics on this number. There are some estimates, though, which vary very widely. If you look at the federal government estimates, they range between 55% to 85% of people are caught while trying to cross the border. And there is a Princeton researcher who studies this phenomenon under a so-called Mexican migration project. I think his name is Douglas Massey. He claims that the probability of being apprehended while trying to cross the southern border is just 10%, which would imply that in 2018, 5 million immigrants managed to cross the border illegally, which to me sounds absurd, but I don't know what to believe when there are such wild statistics doing the rounds.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of takes us back to the southern border wall with the Sinai. I think, when you see such wildly diverging statistics, usually the answer is somewhere in between. And I think, you have to be careful before you overinterpret one or another. Again, there's a politics here to understating the influx of the illegal immigrant population. On the other hand, our estimates can be wildly off as researchers as well. And so, of course, my deference would be that it's probably closer to 10% than it is to 55%. That seems far more reasonable to me, given what I know about the context.
So you're saying that 5 million people actually cross over?
Well, I'd say 5 million is probably certainly more plausible than the alternative, which is, I guess, roughly 1 million.
Right, roughly 1 million.
Yeah. So I think that's probably more reasonable. But I haven't had a chance to take a look at the method, and I think one must always do that. That's kind of what we train you all as master students to think carefully about: is where is this number coming from? What's the nature of the data? Are there any biases in that data? Should I be thinking about some omitted variables in this regression? What's the research design? Do I believe that because of the research design that this omitted variable bias problem is not an issue? Do I think this is a credible estimate? Those are all things that we teach you all to do, and I wish more people in the public domain would ask serious questions about estimates like that, because it very well could be the case that it is 10%. It might also very well be the case it's closer to 50. Who knows?
So you're saying that we'll never know for sure whether if you build a wall, the crime will fall?
I don't know if that's what I just said. I think that we don't know yet which of these estimates is the right one, but I think, one thing is almost certainly true, which is that if we learn anything from the Israeli case, a complete border wall along the sort of the line between U.S. and Mexico will probably just increase the cost for consumers, and in the end have a marginal impact on enforcement. That would be my guess.
I want to move on to some other studies that you've done. In particular, your study, I think, was it on Afghanistan, that said that when rebel groups engage in violence on or around election days, there is a marked decrease in voter turnout, which tends to delegitimize the elections and the victors of the elections. Talking about this in the context of US, where electoral violence, I think, is unheard of, do you think non-violent measures of voter suppression, as they are called, for example, very strict voter ID laws or other forms of stricter voter suppression, are they being used as proxies in the absence of violence to achieve the same effect of depressing voter turnout? Is there something that you've thought about?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, because if we think about the U.S. today, in many ways, indeed, it is not like Afghanistan, in that there's not overt, rebel coordinated violence. There's rather few strongmen going around disrupting the polls. But if we were to rewind about 100 years, and we were to think about elections in the U.S. context, where we had party machines, these party machines did use political violence. Perhaps not of the scale or intensity that we see in Afghanistan, but enough that we would characterize U.S. elections as being marred by election violence. And so it's kind of amazing what a difference 100 years can make. But here in this context, we're still worried about the underlying cause of reduced voter turnout in Afghanistan, we think, is intimidation. You don't need violence necessarily to intimidate a population. you can scare them away from a particular location through the mere threat of the use of force. And so, actually, I had the opportunity to give a lecture to the evening master's program not too long ago, and some excellent students in that program. One of them brought up the possibility that, in the U.S. context, 2016 in particular, that even though there was no overt violence, white supremacists walking around predominantly African-American polling stations openly bearing arms might have a rather similar impact as overt violence. Whether or not that's true, it's kind of difficult to estimate. It's rather difficult for us to do this in Afghanistan too. But I think if one could estimate the impacts, my guess would be that indeed both overt violence like we see in Afghanistan and more veiled intimidation efforts by radicals on both sides. This is not to say that it's not only the far right that's engaged in this kind of voter intimidation, it's also the far left as well. And so, we tend to characterize the far right as being the threat, the only source of threat to voters. But indeed, the threat can come from both sides.
You've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. You've been there, I'm assuming, a number of times, and you've collected so much data. I'm sure you've also followed the story of the troop pullout from Afghanistan. Do you have a view on whether this is a good move, and what should be the best strategy to go about stabilizing the country?
Yeah, so I've had the good fortune of visiting the American University of Afghanistan in July 2017. Incredible campus. It's overcome some enormous difficulties. We, in fact, have one of their esteemed graduates here in the first class of Obama scholars. It's a very difficult place to work, as you astutely point out. And I do have the good fortune of being connected to individuals who have put in a lot of time to gather and systematize data. And so we get to take advantage of that as researchers. I think this question of the U.S. withdrawals is a fundamentally important one and will be a defining moment for the United States. I think, so I have a paper on the initial security transition that happened during the Obama administration. And effectively what we're able to do is we use a lot of these military records coupled with very high-frequency survey data to try and estimate the two waves of the withdrawal. So the first wave is the transfer of legitimate political authority to Afghans. And then the second wave is the physical withdrawal of coalition troops. So what we end up estimating are violence-reducing effects of the first stage, where it looks as if transferring power to local Afghans substantially reduces conflict activity. But then we observe with the actual physical withdrawal of troops, international coalition troops, a surge in Taliban activity. And so there are rather few stories that we think can convincingly explain why you see a reduction in violence in one case and an increase in violence in the other that do not actively involve the Taliban trying to manipulate the signal that the coalition were getting about the effectiveness of our allies on the ground. Drawing down the intensity of attacks during that first stage is something that we know the Taliban were perfectly aware of was something being monitored by the coalition. The coalition was looking at exactly the same data that we're analyzing in making the decision about whether or not to continue the withdrawal. We think that indeed there is something strategic about laying low while your enemy is evaluating their effectiveness of their substitute. And then once they've started to withdraw, the costs of reintervention are so high that there's no way the coalition is going to move back into a place. And then you pop out from behind the bush and you start engaging in active warfare against the incumbent regime. And I think what we've seen since the end of Operation Enduring Freedom at the end of 2014 is indeed a tipping of the balance of political power towards the Taliban. So I'm a little worried in terms of what a transition might mean. I'm more worried not about the transition itself, but about the rather erratic foreign policy decision-making, if one can call it that, that's kind of emanating from the White House at this point. It makes it incredibly difficult for negotiators with the Taliban to be able to credibly commit to a deal that hopefully will lead to some sort of power-sharing arrangement. Not having a stable ally, not having a stable backer, a backer that can claim to withdraw, and then several minutes later is forced to back down from that claim, That's really problematic. And one would think that someone who wrote The Art of the Deal would know the importance of bargaining
He probably
power.
didn't write it though.